Welcome to the Moss Adams presentation of Boost Compliance with System and Organization Controls. My name is Tanya Roldan and I am your host today. We have just a few housekeeping items to improve your participation. For best viewing, close out all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You may adjust placement and window size using the controls in the top right corner of each window, or expand the slide view by dragging the lower right corner to resize. Ask questions today by entering your questions in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. Download a PDF copy of today's slides or the group CPE attendance sheet from the Slides and Handouts widget to the right of the slide view. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, either with the audio or visual aspects of the slides, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. We'll ask polling questions throughout today's presentation. Per the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy webcast CPE standards, CPE credit will be awarded based on your participation in these polls. To respond to a poll, click the button next to your answer and click Submit. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of the polling questions. CPE credit can be awarded only to participants registered as themselves and is not available to participants who view the on-demand version. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our attendance sheet available in the slide deck and handout widget to receive CPE credit. Please have all group members sign the sheet and please remit only 1 sheet per group. We'll track your progress, and when you have earned your CPE credit, you can click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget to download a PDF file to save it to your computer. We'll email a copy of your CPE certificate in 2 weeks if you can't download it today. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances. Now, I'd like to introduce today's presenters, Kradjan and Kim Koch. With their 36 years of combined experience, Chris and Kim are frequently asked to speak on system and organization controls. Kradjan leads Moss Adams' national SOC audit practice and has consulted in the information technology field since 1996. With the advent of privacy principles and the HITRUST Common Security Framework, combined with the recent AICPA updates, Chris is passionate about clients having the latest developing information. And joining Chris today is Kim Koch. Kim has been practicing public accounting since 2001, and with many options for accountants to specialize in, Kim knew early on that SOC audits and attestation engagements were going to be impactful to businesses of all sizes, wanting a solid compliance program, which is why she has spent the past 15 years specializing in conducting SOC 1, 2, and 3 audits, attestation engagements, and internal control assessments. We're proud to have this powerhouse duo deliver information on the recent developments impacting compliance programs today. Chris and Kim, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, hello. We're excited to talk to you today about SOC audits and some of the changes out there and opportunities for you. We have 4 different areas we're going to cover. The first relates to SSAE 18. This is an attestation standard that replaces SSAE 16, which formerly related to SOC 1 reports. SSAE 18 is very broad and it covers attestation engagements as a whole, but today we're going to focus on how those changes affected SOC 1 reports. We're also going to talk about SOC 2 audits and how the 2017 Trust Service Principles and Criteria have been released and how these will impact future engagements. These aren't effective. They don't have to be implemented until 2018, but they will require some changes in your current SOC 2 report, and so it's good for us to be discussing with those now so that there's time to prepare. Third, this is really exciting opportunity, but now there's a SOC report that's not just for service organizations, it's really for any type of organization, and it relates to cybersecurity risk management. I know organizations are under increasing pressure to demonstrate that they're managing cybersecurity threats, and having this form of SOC report done is a good way to show stakeholders that there is a good cybersecurity risk management program in place. And so we'll give you some more information about that. And then lastly, we're going to talk about how you can enhance your SOC 2 report, including frameworks such as HITRUST or HIPAA. If those are other frameworks that you follow, then this might be a good opportunity for you to increase your current SOC 2 report. So first we're going to talk about SSAE 18 and the SOC 1 development. So some of the changes to be aware of is that first, SSAE 18 is effective for reports issued after May 1st, 2017. So if you've currently had or recently had a SOC 1 report issued, perhaps for March 31st year end, many of these incorporated the changes of SSAE 18. However, I know that many clients have a June 30th year end, a September 30th year end, or a December 31st year end, or any month in between, and you might still be working on implementing these changes. So we want to go through how those changes affect SOC reports. There's definitely changes that are auditor specific, but then there's also changes as a service provider that you'll want to keep in place. Another item is that we won't spend a lot of time talking about with SSAE 18, but it really changes the naming convention of SOC reports. You know, several years ago, these were referred to as SAS 70s, and then SSAE 16 was implemented, and we would talk about, call them SSAE 16 or SOC 1 reports interchangeably. Now with SSAE 18, going back to referring to these as just a SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3 report. So we no longer need to refer to them by the attestation number. So that's something to be aware of. We'll also spend some time talking about complementary subservice organization controls. These are also referred to as CSOCs. This is one of the bigger changes that does impact the service auditor, so we'll spend some time talking about this in more detail. And then lastly, there's emphasis in SSAE 18 about a stronger vendor management program. So we'll go through some ways that you can increase your vendor management program for monitoring your subservice organization. These are kind of the highlights of SSAE 18. There's some other changes that aren't as big of a deal, but if you were to look at a report that was issued under SSAE 18, you'll notice changes to the wording of the service auditor's report and also some refinements in the assertion wording. So now we're going to go to a polling question. Remember, you need to answer the polling questions in order to get CPE for this hour. So the first polling question is, does your organization issue a SOC 1 report? And the four choices are yes, and we have implemented SSAE 18 already. Or yes, we do issue a SOC 1 report, but we're in the process of implementing SSAE 18. Or no, we don't currently issue a SOC 1 report, but it's something we're thinking about issuing. Number 4, we don't issue a SOC 1 report, but we do get it from our service providers and read through them. Or 5 is none of the above, meaning that you really don't do much with SOC 1 reports. And I'll give you a few seconds to answer this question, and then we'll go to the polls to see the results. Okay, I'm going to close the polls in about 5 seconds. You want to make sure that you've submitted a response. Okay, so the responses are 6% of you have issue a SOC 1 report and you've already implemented SSAE 18. 10% of you issue a SOC 1 report, but you probably have a year-end date that's coming up, and so you're still in the process of issuing the report under SSAE 18. 2% of you are thinking that you might need to do a SOC 1 report in the future. 48% of you aren't necessarily the service provider who's issuing a SOC 1 report, but you do obtain SOC 1 reports and read and evaluate them. And then 34% of you at this time don't do anything with a SOC 1 report, but hopefully one of your takeaways today is that even if you're not the type of organization that would need to produce a SOC 1 report, that you're thinking if you do have service providers where you should be collecting those SOC 1 reports and evaluating them. When we get to the vendor management program part of this session, that'll be a good information for you whether or not you're producing a SOC 1 report or evaluating SOC 1 reports. So now let's spend a little bit more time talking about complementary subservice organization controls. And I'm going to refer to these as CSOCs as we go through the next few slides. But these are when there's a control that the service organization's management assumes will be implemented by their subservice organization. And these controls are necessary for the achievement of a control objective. And so to put this in a little simpler terms, in a SOC 1 report, when there is a section of controls being audited, those controls relate to a control objective that's also listed in the report. And sometimes that control objective cannot be fully achieved unless it's a combination of the service provider's controls, but also some of the controls at their subservice organizations. So an example of this would be, say you're a claims processor and maybe you process multiple types of claims like medical claims, dental claims, vision claims, and for dental claims you outsource that processing to another service organization. If you had a control objective that talked about the completeness and accuracy of medical, vision, and dental claims, in order to meet that control objective, there would be controls that you're not in charge of as a service organization, but your subservice organization is in charge of. And those controls would be really important to meet that control objective. And so these are controls then that get listed in the SOC 1 report as a CSOC to draw attention to the reader that they would want to make sure that if they're reviewing the subservice organization's report, that they're looking for those controls. Another thing to emphasize is even though these controls are listed as a CSOC in a SOC 1 report, the service auditor is not extending procedures to these controls. That's why they're listed, is to give you guidance that you'd want to look for these in a separate subservice provider's SOC report. So now that you have a little bit of understanding on CSOCs and some examples of those, probably thinking through, well, how do we determine what we need to do to include CSOCs in our own report? So some of the best ways to do this is first figure out who are your subservice organizations. And there's a difference between a subservice organization and a vendor. And so it's important to understand those differences. A subservice organization is where that service organization is performing a part of the controls that really lead to the internal control over financial reporting for a user entity. It's not a service where they may be doing something for you, but the service organization is really in charge of making sure that it's done correctly and monitoring and completeness and accuracy. A common example is data centers where service organizations, when they're using a third-party data center, this is a common subservice organization. And there's good information in the SOC 1 audit guide if you're trying to determine if an organization really meets the criteria of a subservice organization or a vendor. But for CSOCs, we really want to be focused on subservice organizations. So it's first important to make sure we got those right. Next is really understanding what is the service those subservice organizations are performing. And some good steps of really evaluating this is to look at the SOC 1 report from the subservice organization, or it could even be a SOC 2 report. Reading through contracts with the subservice organization, looking at user and technical manuals that they might provide. And these are good ways to really understand the different parts of the control process that might be the responsibility of a subservice organization rather than your service organization. And once you've reviewed these, then it's also good to really look at your SOC report and look at each of the control objectives and think through the way that control objective is written. Are there items of that control objective that cannot solely be met by you, but also must be met partially by the subservice organization? And as you do this analysis, you'll want to document if the control objective is completely done by you and there's no CSOCs, or if there's areas where you would expect a subservice organization to be responsible, and you want to start defining those controls. And this is definitely something that you don't have to do alone or on your own. We encourage you to work with your service auditor in doing this. I know as we helped clients implement SSAE 18 for the 331 year ends, it was really a process where we worked together to help our clients identify where the CSOCs would be in place and what those are. And the controls don't need to get real granular. It's not something that needs to be mapped directly to the subservice organization SOC report, but you want to have enough detail to give the reader an idea of the types of controls they would expect to be in a subservice organization report for them to be able to rely on that control objective. So next we're going to talk about vendor management program. This is another point of emphasis in SSAE 18. And even if you don't issue a SOC 1 report, but you issue a SOC 2 report, I think the guidance here is really valuable because in general, I think improvements can be made on evaluating service organizations and really making sure that you're doing your due diligence of service organizations. And so within SSAE 18, they give several ideas of different types of procedures that can be performed for evaluating subservice organizations. And I wanted to walk through each of these examples. The first is reviewing and reconciling output reports. So this isn't something that'd be applicable to every type of service organization, but if you're using a subservice organization where they're doing some type of processing, then there's likely reports that go with that. And maybe you're giving them information and then there's an output report. And so you should be reviewing those reports to make sure the information is complete and accurate. And that would be a great vendor management control to have in place. The key to remember on this is when you're performing these controls, you want to keep good documentation to show that you are performing these controls. So, you know, maybe it's physically signing off on a report or keeping a log of the different procedures you've done to review and reconcile reports from your subservice organization. Another example is just having periodic discussions with your subservice organization. There might be some specific questions that you ask them on a certain reoccurring basis, or at least even when you're onboarding a new subservice organization. And so going through this process and documenting the responses you get is another great monitoring control to have in place. Another example would be regular site visits. This might be a very practical example if you have a physical data center as a subservice organization. You know, going and performing a walkthrough and making sure that you really see the different physical and environmental controls in place is a great control. And the more you can document that site visit and show exactly what you saw and if you noticed any gaps where you expected controls in place, that's a great monitoring control. One of the most popular monitoring controls that we see in place that really works well, and this is often a control in a SOC 1 report showing that a service organization is monitoring a subservice organization, is obtaining the SOC report from a subservice organization. And we're going to spend more time talking about when you get that SOC report, what are the procedures you need to do to make sure that it's complete and accurate and that it has everything in it that you would expect. It's more than just getting that report and handing it to your auditors or sticking it in a drawer, but really taking a good analysis of that report. A couple other items you could consider: if you do have an internal audit department, perhaps there's different controls that you choose to test for your subservice organization, and you go on site and test those controls. If you do that, having good documentation to show that's done is another good monitoring control. And this isn't necessarily something that you have to do or that has to be done every year, or every control has to be tested each year, but it's something to consider that maybe on some periodic basis there are certain controls that you want to test for yourself or through your internal audit department. And then lastly, anytime you're having communications with your subservice organization, or even looking at information that they've produced, keeping track of different types of customer complaints or the regulatory agency reports, these are things that also show that you're monitoring your subservice organization. And the key to good vendor management is performing these procedures, but really also taking the time to document what you've done and keeping a log of that, because then it becomes good audit evidence to also include in your SOC 1 report, showing that you do have a strong vendor management program in place. So to talk a little bit more about the SOC reports as a vendor management tool, when you get your SOC report from your third-party service providers annually, or your subservice organizations, some things that you'll want to spend some time looking at are, one, looking at the audit opinion and determining, did your subservice organization get a clean audit opinion? You want to look at the examination period that is covered by the report, figure out when that year-end date is, and how close it aligns with your year-end date, and how long did it take to get that report issued? We'd normally expect that within a few months after the end of the examination date that the report would be issued, because then it's much more fresh. But if it took them much longer to issue the report, that could be an indicator of finding out, well, why did it take them so long to get this report to the marketplace? You want to spend some time evaluating their service auditor. Is it someone who's reputable, and making sure that it's done by a firm that you would expect to have the credentials to issue SOC reports. Then you want to dive a little bit deeper and really read through that narrative, making sure it covers what you expect it to cover, and starting to look at the different control objectives and the different controls. Oftentimes, service auditors and the service organizations having a SOC report done, if no one's questioning what's in the report, they'll just continue to include the same control objectives and related controls each year. But if they start getting questions on a certain area where you would expect it to be in place, then they might add that in the future. So it's really good to make sure not just that they have a SOC report, but that you've also evaluated that it's comprehensive enough to meet your needs. There's always a section in the report, if it is a type 2 report, that has each of the controls, the actual test procedures, and if there's any exceptions. And that's another area that you want to scan through to identify if there's any exceptions and how those exceptions would affect you. So sometimes there's an exception and maybe there really is not much of an impact to you as a service organization, but sometimes it could impact your operations, and maybe there's changes you would make there. So it's important to document those exceptions and the impact. Two other areas to look at are the complementary user entity controls. So these are controls where it's saying that the user entity, in order to rely on this SOC 1 report, then the user entity needs to have these controls in place. And so you want to go through and evaluate if you really do have those controls in place, or maybe it's something that doesn't apply to you. But there should be an evaluation done related to complementary user entity controls. And then the CSOCs that we just talked about, you'll start seeing these in more SOC reports as they become released over the next few months. And so for the CSOCs, you want to go through and evaluate these and decide if there's a subservice report that you also need to obtain and evaluate and confirm that these controls are in that subservice organization report. The last thing is, depending on the year-end date, there might be the opportunity where too much time has elapsed and you need to get a bridge letter. And so this is a letter that basically the service organization represents and says that no controls have changed significantly since the report was issued. And the most important thing about doing this evaluation is for this to be a control in your SOC report, you'd want to have formally documented results. So we have a nice checklist that we give our clients that helps them document all these different important items when they're reviewing the SOC report. And so using that or something similar is a good way to make sure that the SOC report has been reviewed and documented. And even if you're not a service provider who's issuing a SOC 1 report, I know from the polling questions, many of you were just organizations that read SOC 1 reports. Following the same method for the SOC 1 reports that you receive is a great control for your own vendor management program, even if you don't have your own SOC 1 report. There's a few changes we also wanted to discuss that really affect more of the service auditor, but it's good for you to be aware of these changes as an auditee, because you might wonder, why is my service auditor changing their approach a little bit, or they're using some different terminology. And so there's not a lot of detail to be aware of here, but just a few things that changed with SSAE 18. One is there's more specific and definitions regarding a definition of a misstatement and also the risk of material misstatement. And because of this, it adds to the procedures that need to be done for in the planning phase and throughout the engagement of the service auditor, really considering the risk, which areas there's a higher risk of material misstatement, and how they're going to address those areas. Another item is the reliability of information. So generally in the past, I would say we've always done a good job of making sure that the information is reliable, meaning if we got a population to sample for a SOC 1 report test, that we did procedures to make sure that that population was complete. But SSAE 18, it adds emphasis on the importance of really making sure that the information service auditor is getting is reliable. So you might see some increased questions or procedures related to making sure that populations and other artifacts are complete and accurate. So this is just a snapshot of the SSAE 18 changes that affect SOC 1 reports. It really does highlight the changes that have a larger impact on organizations that do issue a SOC 1 report. But if you want some more details, two good resources are SSAE 18, so reading the actual attestation standard, and there's a large section on SOC 1 reports, but also reading the AICPA audit guide. That there's an audit guide that's specific to SOC 1 reports, and what I really like about the audit guide is it's very easy to read, it's very practical, and it gives good examples. It's geared towards service auditors, but there's definitely sections that I think are valuable for an auditee to look at and read, and so that might be a good resource if you want more details on SSAE 18. So now we're going to go to our second polling question. Remember to make sure you answer this question so you can get CPE. The question is, does your organization have a SOC 2 report? And the answers, or not the answers, but the options are yes or no, but we need to issue a SOC 2 report. No, but we obtain and read SOC 2 reports from third parties, or none of the above, meaning you don't do much with a SOC 2 report. As we transition in the upcoming slides to talking about SOC 2 reports, we wanted to get a feel for our audience and what is their interaction with SOC 2 reports. I'll give you a few more seconds to answer the question before I close the polls. Okay, I'm going to close the polls. Okay, the responses are 9% of the audience issues a SOC 2 report, 2% are thinking about issuing a SOC 2 report, 39% obtain and read SOC 2 reports from third parties, and 50% don't do much with a SOC 2 report. So this will still be good information for learning more about a SOC 2 report and determining if there is some SOC 2 reports that you should be obtaining from your service providers, as well as some changes to look for on the horizon related to SOC 2 reports. And with this, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Kradjan to talk about SOC 2 and the trust services criteria changes.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kim. I really like that overview of the changes going on within SSAE 18, and I think it's really important how we were able to emphasize that both the CSOCs and the vendor management subservice organization review. I know that's going to play out pretty heavily throughout the rest of the discussion we have this morning as well. So what I want to do next is talk a little bit about the SOC 2 trust service criteria, the new release that came out in April, and allow organizations to understand what this looks like going forward. So with the audience being a good mix of users of the SOC 2 reports, really what we want to do is emphasize the fact that the underlying trust services criteria that's used within the reports to organize and have service organizations present their controls is really being expanded now for reporting purposes. And really what this is doing is having two sets of criteria in the market for a temporary period of time. There's the existing 2016 criteria, which are effectively now known as the TSP Section 100A, and those are the being replaced by the 2017 or the Trust Service Criteria TSP Section 100. So it's important as people are reading the reports and looking at opinion letters, understanding what they're reviewing, to look at that delineation. Effectively, the 2016 criteria are still permissible to be used up through periods ending December 15th, 2018. So we're seeing a slower adoption of these just because there's quite a bit involved, which we'll talk about here today. But there are organizations starting to make that evaluation and go through some initial mappings. However, after December 15th, 2018, the 2016, the existing criteria will be superseded. They'll no longer be able to be used. So there's probably at least another year of reporting that's available for organizations to use with this current trust service criteria set. And as we'll talk today, I think it's important for organizations to understand the distinction and see how and when they might want to best adopt those changes. Effectively what we've done as an organization is gone ahead and done an initial mapping that really helps provide direction in that process. So as organizations are looking at it, they'll be able to undergo their own initial gap assessment, and then from there be in a position to assess the potential addition of new controls they might need to add into the reporting, as well as take into account potential remediation steps that might be necessary to conform with the 2017 Trust Service Criteria. Some of the most immediate changes and things to be aware of is, first of all, the 2016 Trust Service Criteria are being amended to also take into account the 2013 COSO framework. And you might wonder why are these 17 principles being adopted? Well, really a number of reasons. First of all, alignment with SEC registrants and others in the market that require this conformity for their ongoing reporting program. Secondarily, we have an introduction of the cybersecurity SOC reporting, which we'll be talking about in a moment. A lot of that deals around the governance of security controls and security program. And in order to provide a comprehensive framework for that reporting, it's necessary to use a standardized framework such as COSO 2013 as the foundation for that. Other things that we'll identify and we'll talk through here is adding additional criteria that really provide clarity around some of the reporting needs. So part of this is a consolidation where there may have been some additional redundancy or duplication between the existing 2016 criteria. In addition, what we also find is some refinements in order to break out, for clarity purposes, internal versus external parties and how they might be, the criteria might apply. So based upon feedback and also based upon the need to take into account the governing frameworks such as COSO. These latest changes have come into being. One of the pieces you're going to see is that in the last few years, the privacy principle went through a very significant upgrade, and so it really helps leverage that existing changes to bring that into the reporting body itself as well. So kind of an important way to view this will be to look at the common criteria set, and this has been modified slightly. For those of you who are familiar with COSO and those of you who are familiar with different reporting frameworks, you're going to see first and foremost that some of the categories have been modified. For instance, common criteria 1 now deals with control environment versus the organization administrative matters. Risk assessment and monitoring activities really begin to have titles that conform with the language within COSO. But more significantly, when we go underneath the hood with these, what we find is that the way in which they're being administered gets into much more specificity around fraud evaluation, definition of controls, how they're being, the risk assessment then actually helps inform the definition of the control activities, which then feed into the report, dealing with the governing body that oversees the reporting of the control environment that's being audited. And so in many respects, it's very, very important to understand that there's a pivoting going on here in the presentation. In addition, we'd encourage all organizations to go out and they're dealing with the SOC 2 audit, to get a copy of the current SOC 2 principles. They are published and available. They're finalized now by the ASCPA and available through their website. And we think that'll help provide some clarity. I know with our clients, as we're getting this year's planning cycle, we're starting to get into more discussion around this as well. In addition to those common criteria, the other principles remain availability, confidentiality, processing integrity, and privacy, each of which has been amended in some fashion to also take into account the changes that are going on within the new reporting. Interestingly enough, a small definitional element, but an important one, has been the fact that we're really going from a naming convention of calling this the Trust Services Principles, the Trust Services Criteria, with the primary reason being that principle now has a definition under COSO and a definition under the Trust Services. And by doing so, by putting the emphasis on the common criteria definition for SOC 2 reporting, it helps provide greater clarity that the principles are in effect referencing the COSO framework. Next, we really want to kind of restate some of the core changes that have occurred within the Trust Services criteria for greater understanding and retention for the people attending today. There is, if you go through the listing of the new criteria listing, first of all, a call out of the different COSO principles. And then underneath that, you're going to wind up seeing suggestion of how do organizations have a code of conduct, how do they have a board of directors, how do they deal with fraud, risk and exposure, and continuing to go through the list, dealing with the tone at the top of the organization, and really looking at the way in which the governing board then goes through the risk assessment process to define its controls, and within that, how those wind up being communicated out throughout the organization, and ultimately how those are used to inform both internal and external parties about the internal control environment. In addition, what we see is that the emphasis around risk assessment and risk management has been broadened. So while not explicitly being stated from the SOC 1 SSAE 18 update, we do see a greater emphasis around things such as vendor management. And we're encouraging our clients to really adopt a similar level of rigor around these practices, especially when they've got organizations like AWS, a data center, other cloud providers coming into the mix, which also provide a very important handshakes to the very element of the system boundaries that are being involved for the audit. And then you'll see greater delineation in the logical access and physical access controls to really make that easier to provide less duplication of the controls themselves. And then finally, at the very end, much tighter, crisper change management criteria listing, and then the residual principles: availability, confidentiality, processing, integrity, and privacy, going through some redefinition that allows a little easier usage by the reader, or by the user. So that brings us to our next polling question and really sets us up for our next discussion here. This polling question, again, for CPE credit, is that the trust service criteria covers which of the following categories? Which of the following categories? To see how the audience was paying attention. Security is the first. Security and confidentiality being the second. Security, availability, confidentiality, processing integrity, and privacy being the third option, or the 17 COSO principles being the fourth. So again, this is for CPE credit. We'd like to ask you to be sure to click and then submit your response. And I think that will give us a chance to give you credit for your CPE. So I'm going to close the poll in 5 seconds. 3, 2, 1. And excellent response rate, 72.7, 73% of the audience got the correct answer, or the most complete answer, we should say, of security, availability, confidentiality, processing integrity, and privacy. And with that, let me hand it back to Kim. We'd like to explore next the topic of SOC for cybersecurity.
Great, thanks, Chris. This is really a topic where we could probably dedicate an hour, but I hope your takeaway today is that you're aware that this is an opportunity out there for organizations, and that you'll continue to look for opportunities to learn more about this with us in the future. So the SOC for cybersecurity is also referred to as Cybersecurity Risk Management Examination Overview, and this is an independent and objective report that you have done to provide to stakeholders, management, investors, regulators, to really show that you have the right cybersecurity framework in place to mitigate and manage risks. And the great thing about this report is that along with it, the AICPA has issued a cybersecurity risk management reporting framework. And so this is how you kind of prepare for the cybersecurity SOC report, is going through this framework and making sure that you have the right controls in place to really document how you're reducing cybersecurity threats and how you would respond to threats and recover from any breaches. And this report, it's for general use, so it's different than other SOC reports in that those reports, the use is limited, but this is more for general use, and we'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. It can be used by any entity, so other SOC reports are specific to service organizations. This is something that could be applicable to any of you on the call today for your organization to really show your stakeholders that you have a good cybersecurity framework in place. And there's a lot of flexibility in the controls that are in place in the frameworks that this covers. The report contents, there's a description that's very detailed that walks through your cybersecurity program and the different controls you have in place. And this is a really important part of the report because it gives a lot of the details that you're providing on your program. And then along with that is a management assertion where you'd be asserting that you have the program in place, and then the independent auditor's opinion or the practitioner's opinion. And the thing about, as you prepare for one of these, maybe it's not something that you want to necessarily jump into and have audited right away. So a good idea as you do this and as you make sure that you have the right cybersecurity risk management program in place is you could set this up with your service auditor or a third party to go through a readiness assessment process first, where you're really making sure that you have the right controls in place, that you have the right evidence for those controls, and that you're mitigating any gaps. And then once you've determined you got the right controls in place and you're audit ready, that's where then you could move forward with having this SOC engagement for cybersecurity done. And the reason these reports are just these 3 sections and they don't have what would you see in other SOC type 2 reports, a big section that has all the different controls, the auditor's tests, and the results, is because that's the information that makes it so they can't be for general use. And so by just having the description, it makes it so that this report doesn't have proprietary information that maybe wouldn't be understood by everyone, and it can be a general use report. So some of the great benefits of this report are showing that you're being very transparent in your cybersecurity management program and really proving that you actually have it in place. You know, it's one thing to go to your board or to other management meetings and explain what's in place, but to actually have a validated report showing that this is actually what you're doing and that you do have these controls operating effectively really helps build that cybersecurity program. This can also be a report that would be used for making better strategic decisions. Perhaps it provides a competitive advantage for against your other organizations or competitors in the marketplace. It really helps build your reputation. And then depending on what kind of requests you get regarding your security program, this might provide some operational efficiencies. Instead of answering a bunch of questionnaires, you'd have this report in place to say, here, this is our cybersecurity program and this is what we're doing. So it really is a great opportunity that many of you on this call might want to spend some more time evaluating if it's right for your organization. We're going to move to our last polling question of the day. So after hearing about the 3 different types of SOC reports, including the cybersecurity report, and that we're going to hear more in a few minutes about how a SOC 2 report can go well with HITRUST, we wanted to find out what kind of report would best meet your organization's needs. Is that a SOC 1 report, a SOC 2 report, a cybersecurity risk management examination, or also known as a SOC for cybersecurity, or a SOC 2 report that includes HIPAA or HITRUST? And I'll give you a few seconds to answer the question. Okay, I'm going to close the poll in just a couple of seconds. Okay, and the results are 26% think a SOC 1 report best meets their needs, 12% say a SOC 2, 43% like the idea of the SOC for cybersecurity, which I'm not surprised since it seems like a lot of organizations on the call aren't necessarily service providers, but organizations that read SOC reports. So this would be the type of SOC report that might be good for you to issue because it can show your cybersecurity framework and how you're mitigating those risks. And then 18% for a SOC 2 that incorporates HIPAA and HITRUST. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Chris to talk more about SOC 2 and HIPAA and HITRUST reporting.
Great, thanks, Kim. Well, as we kind of go into this final part of the discussion this morning, what we want to be able to do is talk about the SOC 2 plus HIPAA and HITRUST reporting framework. Really what this is going to allow us to do is talk about how organizations are extending the impact and benefit of the SOC 2 reporting, especially when they're within the healthcare sector. So tech clients effectively have done a couple of things. At the most rudimentary level, they've looked at the HIPAA security requirements, a published framework out there, and done a mapping within an appendix to the report, an unaudited section, that shows what degree the criteria and the controls that have been audited map to those security requirements, not necessarily demonstrating that all HIPAA requirements have been achieved, even within a given requirement, but clearly that there are good alignment, and it also, from an external user standpoint, provides a much easier way to consume the data within the report. We also see that this allows a much clearer alignment of that intersection between SOC 2 and HIPAA. Now, this is useful when organizations aren't required to have a certified representation around their HIPAA compliance. However, many organizations nowadays do, especially when they're in a heavily regulated segment dealing with some major state or insurers or other business partners out there in the market, at which point they get involved with looking at the HITRUST Common Security Framework, or the CSF. Now, if we really want to do a quick comparison of HIPAA versus HITRUST, what we wind up finding is that HITRUST really does provide a very specific updated platform that not only covers HIPAA, but also provides a mapping against other security frameworks, such as PCI, such as Texas health requirements, such as NIST or FedRAMP. So by being able to look at a comprehensive coverage, there is the ability to have a specifically aligned auditing program available. And as we see at the bottom, this very last line, it is a certifiable framework, which does allow a third party to get an audit that their maturity levels and their risk ratings are sufficient that they can demonstrate conformity with the HIPAA standards, security standards. So where we see this really playing out is organizations who need to have a much clearer understanding of what goes into the HITRUST CSF, this Common Security Framework. Most specifically, as organizations get more familiar with this, they're going to find that there's 14 control categories that have been defined out there to effectively define and organize different control listings. Now, those include 13 that are associated with security and one that extends to privacy principle as well. Really, if we could take nothing away from this, there could be up to 845 different requirements within this Common Security Framework. So when we talk about having many different regulated security frameworks that somebody could look to have their organization audited against, this allows organizations to, in effect, pick those that are applicable, and then the Common Security Framework, in essence, filters down to what subset of those are most applicable. And then once those have been determined to be in scope, it then allows an organization to be able to look at the maturity level and ratings around those. So we'll talk a little bit more about that rating program that's very specific to the HITRUST framework in a moment. Looking at specifically, we talk about different control categories where you're going to see quite a bit of similarities to the HITRUST CSF classifications as you would with many of the other security frameworks. In essence, this is what's been adopted by HITRUST, and they've used this to pivot and categorize all of the other frameworks against it. And if you go through an exercise, you wind up seeing by responding to different filtering questions at the front end of assessment using HITRUST, a service organization then can narrow that scope down and determine which of them are applicable, and then also wind up getting a very streamlined presentation at the end of the day of their auditing framework. Looking at these different categories, rather than reciting them to you, I think I'd like to call out that first of all, there's a number of different specific objectives underneath those, and underneath those objectives given requirements. So this does allow you to see how the categories, in essence, wind up expanding to account for all of the 845 requirements statements stated on the prior slide as well, and different control specifications that were noted previously. Something that's very unique and very critical when considering HITRUST is the PRISMA-Based maturity assessment. Now, this assessment really requires that each of those criteria that are being audited and assessed for HITRUST, that an organization needs to look to see that all 5 of these elements are addressed, and then based upon these, what maturity rating would apply. This is very specific and very important to understand for HITRUST. Are there definitely established policies in place? Are there processes and procedures which support those policies? And have those in fact been implemented? Once they've been implemented, have they been measured and tested to ensure that they're operating by management? And if they have, are there corrective action procedures in place to make sure that those are continuously being updated? So this maturity rating becomes very critical to making sure that each of the criteria is being met at an effective level. You'll see that there's very distinct definitions of maturity level on the right on this slide, for each of these 5 factors in the assessment, whether you're non-compliant, somewhat compliant, partially compliant, mostly compliant, or fully compliant. And this, in effect, winds up setting up a very detailed assessment of each of the different controls that would be applicable for an organization. And it does require, after a self-assessment, if you have a validated report, to have all those audited and those ratings that have been defined by management confirmed by an external auditor. So I'd like to kind of make sure your audience is clear on the type of reporting. HITRUST begins with an organization undergoing its own self-assessment. And this is where they actually go through that filtering process to define what is in scope, both from a system-based standpoint, as well as what specific regulations and other areas of security frameworks would be applicable. And from there, defining the given controls that wind up being relevant for their given control specifications. And ultimately, for each of those, defining under PRISM how the policies, processes, implementation, measurements, and management of those are defined from a maturity level. So it's very granular and very precise. If an organization then proceeds to want to have a third party audit those, and many organizations are now required to do so, they can have a validated audit where a firm like Moss Adams can, in fact, validate the assessment and have evidence to demonstrate to HITRUST that those ratings are in fact supportable with verifiable evidence. And if an organization can demonstrate that its controls meet or exceed mature level of rating across the board, they can wind up having a validated report with certification, which really helps demonstrate that they are at a very compliant level of maturity across the board. So this is a wide range of these are available for users in addition to SOC 2 plus HIPAA. And if an organization, in fact, goes through and proceeds with doing a HITRUST CSF audit, it's also possible to then go further, one step further, to link in SOC 2 and plus the HITRUST reporting, either in a mapping in an appendix or actually integrating the 2 reports to produce to the public in a much broader set. So many exciting things happening these days, both with the SOC 2 for cybersecurity, SOC 2 with HIPAA, and SOC 2 corresponding with HITRUST. And just want to make sure folks have a good familiarity with these different frameworks. So with that, let me hand it back over to Kim to give us some final thoughts for the day.
Great, thanks, Chris. Hopefully today you learned something about new related to whether it's a SOC 1, a SOC 2, or the new SOC for cybersecurity report, or even just how to expand your current SOC 2 report to include HIPAA and HITRUST. I do encourage you, if you're interested in the SOC for cybersecurity, to go to the AICPA's webpage. They have great materials on really understanding the framework for this, as well as the actual examination. So I wanted to point you to that. And with that, I'll hand it over to Tanya for our closing.
Thanks, Kim. So, just real quick, we do have 2 questions that came in that I'd like to cover. Take a quick minute if you wouldn't mind. One is, Jean asks, my understanding is that TSP Section 100 is a main guideline document for SOC 2. Are there similar documents that could be used as guidelines for SOC 1 and SOC 3?
Sure, I can take that.
You want it, Kim? Go for it.
Okay, I'll start and you can add. So for SOC 2 and the TSP framework, A SOC 3 report would also follow that same framework. The difference with a SOC 3 is it's a general use report, and so it doesn't have all of the detailed test work in the report, but the underlying controls that would be tested for a SOC 3 follow a SOC 2. For a SOC 1 report, there's not a prescriptive framework because it really varies by service organization on what different control objectives there needs to be in order to provide the user entity information on internal controls over financial reporting. So there's not really a way to have the same framework that would apply for all scenarios. And that's why the SOC 1, you really have to build out your own control objectives.
Great, great. One more real quick. So is the cybersecurity report the same as the SOC 3 report?
And I'll take this one, Kim. It is a distinct report. The SOC 3, as Kim mentioned in the last response, is general use in a more of an executive summary reporting presentation of a SOC 2 report. Not as commonly distributed, but certainly available in the market. In comparison, the SOC for cybersecurity is a standalone report, similar to a SOC 2, but it covers the governance framework that's been established by the AICPA, and it's really designed to provide a very distinct presentation around how an organization can independently demonstrate that it has good security governance practices in place.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. So if you find you have further questions, maybe about mapping the SOC changes or what might have you as your compliance progresses, please don't hesitate to reach out to Chris or Kim. They're always happy to answer your questions. And thank you, Chris and Kim, for your great presentation today. All this, a lot of material, but good timing, and thank you so very much.
You bet, Tony. And I'd like to emphasize for the audience, as a follow-up from today's session, there will be an extended discussion around vendor management coming out next week. And, please check our website for additional information around that session. It's a great opportunity for people to get a very specific drill down on how to potentially go through completing a vendor management profile and using that to help, whether it's for Sarbanes-Oxley purposes or for their own vendor management program, or as it relates back to reviewing their subservice organizations for a SOC report. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And if you'll take a brief minute, just to maybe 30 seconds to complete a survey for us. This tells us how we did, how we can improve, and content that you might like to see in a future webcast or presentation. Again, thank you for joining us.